This is a question that is really very much on my mind. What is going to happen to community relations after Brexit? By this, I think we mean the relations of British black and Asian minority ethnic groups and the very sizable European population in the UK today. It's a question that concerns me very much. I'm a professor at the University of Leeds, and it concerns me a lot about how this is going to play out in a lot of the northern towns, where I think a lot of the action obviously is with Brexit. I mean, the determining votes in some sense on Brexit have happened in a lot of poorer post-industrial northern towns, Labour strongholds, places where UKIP has been making inroads, and where there is a quite explosive cocktail, as it were, of racial, ethnic, minority, migrant relations with British white populations. We're starting some work at Leeds that I hope will be looking at places like Wakefield, Halifax, Keighley, Barnsley, Doncaster, places where I think there's a lot of very interesting potential developments in the next few years. We're all waiting, of course, for what happens in Stoke on the 23rd, which I think will be a next major step. But across the north, from the Midlands through the northwest up to the northeast, I think there's a range of issues that are going to emerge, and where the future of these community relations are going to play out, and that's what we hope to be watching at Leeds with the research we're doing. I thought, though, what I wanted to talk about, and this inevitably becomes a bit of a biographical exercise, in the sense that I'm coming back to these topics on British immigration and race relations after many years really kind of moving away from it, or moving more internationally, looking at these questions, migration issues in other contexts. But my work, going back 25 years, was about post-war immigration, how this transformation happened from the 1950s, 60s onwards to a more settled pattern that I think we were getting used to in the 1980s, 90s and 2000s, and how this has transformed now into the very unsettled and very turbulent and explosive scenario that we're facing today, potentially, I think, with the idea of British nationality, or indeed the idea of English nationality, and how it deals with diversity. So I wanted to review a little bit the history of immigration in the UK in the post-war period, how it got to where it was, how it changed in the 1980s and 90s, and what the consequences of the migration in the 2000s have been leading up to the Brexit event. And then we'll see how far we get and how much I have to kind of improvise after that. But there's a couple of questions I have that I think will lead nicely into what the speakers say, and I think I have a quite different view to both of the speakers. So, but it's a bit uncomfortable for me to comment on them prior to their speeches. So you'll hear my kind of context setting first. I mean, I think the story, as I always saw it, and I think comparatively, I mean, a lot of sociology of race and immigration in Britain tends to have a very negative tone. I mean, sociologists tend to write in a continually critical tone about the society that they're in order to point out the failings and the weaknesses and the blind spots and so forth. But I looked at Britain comparatively with France and wanted to tell always a story about Britain and France as two relative success stories in the context of liberal democracies coming to terms with issues of immigration and issues of integration and multiculturalism and the transformation of national ideas of citizenship. The post-war stories of Britain and France are relatively positive stories. They are the pioneers in Europe of a kind of approach to immigration that has had to be extended to lots of other European member states at a later period, because they had immigration in larger waves at later periods. Britain and France, rather, had significant migrations straight into the post-war period, the 1950s. Obviously, this was a migration very much in the context of the end of the colonies, post-colonial relationships leading to the specific migration of specific groups from specific places into Britain, where there was already a strong and in some senses intimate relationship, which did bring indeed significant amounts of ethnic and racial variety into the British population. This is a long story that I'm sure you're all familiar with, going back to the 1950s and 60s, migration from the West Indies, migration from South Asia, from India, Pakistan, principally Sri Lanka. That this led to this is a brief story I'm giving you. This leads to a particular level of migration in Britain that becomes a familiar kind of part of the nation over time. Of course, in the 1960s, we start seeing significant white reaction against this migration. We get the first kinds of race riots against black populations, the first reactions of certain British urban locations against immigrant and minority populations. We see the rise of voices against immigration. Enoch Powell's famous 1968 speech, the Rivers of Blood speech, which of course is a precursor in many senses to some of the situations we're facing today. And what's striking about the British story when you look at this story is how Britain reacted to the Enoch Powell moment, the 1968 moment, was really it was a reaction from the centre against an extreme position that was seen as unacceptable, that was seen as really a rejection of Britain's ability to encompass and integrate the immigrant and racial diversity that the colonies had brought it in the post-war period. And so you see at the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s the emergence of a rather progressive race and ethnic relations framework. I think it's 1968, the first act. 1976 completes it. The famous Roy Jenkins, the architect in many ways of the 1976 legislation. A kind of British adoption of American civil rights in the UK context, so it's adapted to this scenario. Also at the time of a significant immigration stop, 1973-74, across all of Europe, there's an end to this primary labour migration that has brought a new settled migration during the post-war period, and then the families that follow it, and the beginning of a period of relative population stability and settlement for those populations. And they're still at this point in time under something like 2% of the population. I mean, it's a relatively small population, although significant in particular locations. Now, there is never, of course, an immigration stop as such. Immigration always continues, however draconian the immigration control, because you will always have family migration and migrants getting in through various channels. But there is a sort of sense in which in the 1970s Britain sets up a kind of framework for immigrant integration that is based on a kind of manageable model, the end of the colonial migration period. Now, this I think settles down, although Mrs. Thatcher, of course, uses quite a lot of rhetoric about kind of adopting certain rhetoric about English nationalism in order to sustain a more nation-centred vision in the 1980s. But what is striking in the 1980s is that the British race relations and immigration settlement of that period more or less commands cross-party support. It's not something that's challenged by the Conservative Party. It's throughout the 1980s, it's something that's in place. It's seen to be working in local contexts, in London, in Birmingham, in other places which really are truly multi-ethnic in a deep political sense, through the representation of these minorities. But something starts happening in the 1980s, which is, of course, external to the UK's shrinking into an island nation state, absorbing immigrants from its colonies, which is a changing position of Britain in the context of the globe, effectively, globalization and all that, and of course European integration, which starts to have an impact on these things. Now, globalization, partly driven by the liberalization of that period, the opening up of Britain as a business destination, as a world destination in other senses, leads to new flows of migrants. Inevitably, you start getting new flows of migrants in the 1980s, new forms of lower end, sometimes irregular, migrants coming into Britain, filling service sector jobs, coming in an increasing number of African migrations, an increasing number from the Middle East, other migrants from other parts of Asia, large numbers of Chinese migrants who often are not discussed very openly as part of the kind of British picture. In other words, a emerging diversity that really doesn't fit the old pattern of ethnic and race relations in Britain. Up to this point, we have a relatively stable pattern of ethnic and race relations that is a relationship between white, black, and Asian minorities, and then the emergence effectively of a Muslim identity as the kind of other part of the familiar pattern of British immigrant populations. Now this is changed by migrants effectively coming from everywhere, and you start to get a global migration, particularly in London, that is transforming the kind of tapestry or the social diversity that is associated with immigration. Anthropologists start talking about this as super diversity. Steve Vertevec coins this word in the late 1990s. Anthropologists Susan Wessendorf, Suzanne Hall, written very interesting works on the transformations of super diverse London. You know, for example, parts of London that are very African, that really have no relationship to the old West Indian types of London. You get a serious sense of a very different kind of Britain emerging. In other words, this is a global Britain. This is a super diverse Britain with a massive range of different kinds of immigrants and very different kinds of ethnic and racial relations as a consequence of this. But still concentrated in the major cities, still very much linked to service sector-driven, lower-end migration, the emergence of all kinds of new communities in London. I don't have the off-the-cuff figures, but you know, there's the numbers of languages in London, the numbers of national communities in London is enormous. London is the only other city on the planet that's really like this is New York, or possibly New York, Los Angeles. This is a true immigrant megalopolis in a sense, which is of course why London votes the way it does as well on Brexit. So that's part of the picture. That's what's going on from the 1980s and 90s. That's global Britain. And that's not going to change because of Brexit, by the way. I mean, one of the things that's not going to change is immigration controlled for non-Europeans. I mean, which is draconian, but which has never been able to seal Britain from immigration. You know, most of the immigrants in Britain are not European nationals. They are nationals of other countries from around the world. Something like 60 to 70% of the immigrant population in Britain is non-European. But of course, what also happens from the 1990s, because of the Maastricht Treaty, 1993, the completion of the idea of European citizenship, and then the accession agreements of 2004, is that you get a new wave of European migrants coming to the UK. It's very important to know that the initial waves of new Europeans are not East European construction workers or people working in very low-end, low-wage packing jobs in Lincolnshire, but highly educated European young people generally, usually coming in to study in the UK. They're the people that you see at Pret-a-Manger in London, or on the train serving you tea, or in fact everywhere you go in Britain, the young people from all over Europe who have made Britain their home during this period. They start getting going in the 1990s as a result of Maastricht, and this is then followed by a very large and growing wave of East Europeans, beginning in 2004, coming to Britain largely because of labour market conditions, because Britain is the one country, along with Sweden and Ireland, that opens its doors to the migrants without any kind of accession barriers. Now, the short story about all of this is that this is the source of the disaster, right? The source of the disaster that everybody wants to pin on the Labour Party of that period is that they chose to open the doors, according to a liberal logic of immigrant capacity, effectively, of international capacity that Britain has at the time, and that this leads to a disastrously excessive amount of East European migration to the country that radically unsettles the existing ethnic and racial settlement in the country, and leads to the UKIP movement, which is based around a kind of rejection of European migration in the country. This is the simple story. I mean, UKIP obviously trades in a blurry idea of immigration, which associates European migration with non-European refugees, with Muslims, or with anybody else, in fact. I mean, there's elements in the Brexit campaign where the racial line was clearly crossed in the latter stages of the campaign, in which any foreigner, whether it's foreignness according to colour or citizenship, effectively could start to feel rather uncomfortable in this country again. A lot of black British are saying, well, we heard a lot of this stuff in the 1960s and 70s, and it's alarming to hear it back on the political agenda. But there is a question here, I think, that we hopefully should pose this evening. I think we have the two speakers here to kind of set this up for us. They will have a different view, perhaps, on these things. But I think what we need to know is what on earth happened to Britain, the Britain of the 1990s that was a Britain, a multi-ethnic Britain, a multiracial Britain. The Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, which reported in 2000, this is the high point of multicultural reflection. It's a report that was put together under the chairmanship of Bhikkhu Parekh, who was chairman of the Commission for Racial Equality. It included the social theorist Stuart Hall, Tariq Madood from Bristol. They came up with a report that pictured Britain as a consequence of the 1990s and the globalization of Britain in a very different way, as a country of diasporas, of people living in a national space, as it were, but whose allegiances and identities really were diasporic, were global, were multiracial, multi-ethnic on all levels. This is the kind of high point, I think. And what happened in 2000 is that the Daily Telegraph got hold of this book, or the report, before it came out, ran a scandal-mongering article about it, accusing effectively the authors of the report of being traitors to the UK and undermining British nationalism, undermining British citizenship. This idea of the diasporic Britain was a step too far, in other words. And the Labour Party got cold feet. At this point, it basically went back on this commitment on multiculturalism and multi-ethnic Britain, and went back to models of national citizenship, of integration, of a kind of island idea of the nation. Gordon Brown, David Blunkett, promoting a different kind of vision for the country, which has ruled ever since, really, in terms of the immigration line. And they also, I think, at this moment chose to change the emphasis on multiracial, multi-ethnic Britain to open it up to a different kind of immigration. Britain has a demand for immigration, but maybe the gamble that Labour Party made in this period was that it could have its demand for immigration satisfied by white migrants from the rest of Europe in some sense. And I think there's an interesting trade-off here, I think, on race and whiteness that has, of course, backfired, because nowadays the people who are getting racialized in the UK are not just black, Asian, minority, ethnic British, but are Poles, Romanians, Italians, Greeks, Spanish, anybody, in fact, that is not English and can be seen as a kind of racially or ethnically different in some sense. And this is now an everyday fact of life in terms of the hate crime and so on that is growing in lots of parts of Britain, and which we're also looking at as part of our project. We're working with the local police and councils to really see what the effects of Brexit are going to be on these relations. It's a cocktail, it's explosive, and it's really been something that has been stoked, I think, by the UKIP, but which has long historical roots in the policies of previous governments. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.